And I will share my screen. All right, great. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Wildlife Wednesday with the Alaska Wildlife Alliance. My name is Kelsey Hansen. I'm the outreach coordinator with the Alaska Wildlife Alliance. And AWA is a wildlife nonprofit that does work in the state of Alaska to just make sure that wildlife are being scientifically and ethically managed. We hold these free Wildlife Wednesdays thanks to our members, and without them, we could not do the work that we do and have these free events. So thank you, those who are in attendance. We are joined tonight by guest speakers, Galen, Hecht, and Benjamin Meyer with the Kenai Watershed Forum. AWA has worked with the Kenai Watershed Forum in the past, and they do great work and help to protect some really vital ecosystems that impact not only salmon, but so many other species that rely on salmon, and also clean waters, and an example species being the critically endangered beluga whales that AWA helps monitor in the spring and fall. So big stars that we have with us tonight. We're really grateful to have both here tonight. They're volunteering their time and expertise tonight to be here, and we just really appreciate them being able to share some free time and knowledge with us tonight. So they're going to be discussing salmon in Alaska, especially down on the Kenai Peninsula, and just how people and salmon can coexist. But before we jump into their presentation, I'm just going to give a little brief intro to AWA and some of the work that we've done and are doing. And then I will hand it off to both of them in just a moment. So tonight, during the presentation, I'm just going to ask and encourage that you keep your video off and your mute on, and that'll help to create a very seamless presentation for the evening without any interruptions, and will help with the bandwidth as well. So be mindful of that. And if you ask a question, or if you have any questions that come up at any point throughout the presentation, do feel free to throw them into the chat at the bottom of your screen, and we will address them at the end. We have about 10 to 15 minutes for a Q&A session for Galen and Ben about anything they've presented on. And most importantly, we just hope you have a good time, you enjoy something new, and that you share information that you've gained with others that you know. So again, we do work in the state to help protect Alaska's wildlife. We've been around since 1978. We are a nonprofit, and these presentations are really thanks to our members. They're free because of them, and so we're very thankful for that, so that we get to share so much information about the wildlife in the state. We do kind of 3 tiers in Alaska Wildlife Alliance. We have citizen science, we have education, and we have a whole lot of advocacy. And some citizen science that just closed up was beluga monitoring in the fall season, just closed up this week. So if you want to help monitor critically endangered cook inlet beluga whales, check out Alaska Beluga Monitoring Partnership.org. AWA hosts and manages the Kenai and Kasilof River sites alongside Kenai Peninsula College. So really fun doing that. We also do education, we do tabling, and we're starting up some programs for next year that we're really excited about to help continuing on with that. And that photo above is one of our members, Lori Craig, holding up a bear aware sign that we posted on the electric bus system in Juneau. So maybe you've seen that. And advocacy, recently we filed a polar bear lawsuit to protect Beaufort Sea polar bears up in the Arctic. And we also are doing a map the trap report and have a proposal to the Board of Game for January to propose 50-yard setbacks on popular trails in the Matsu Basin. So more on that can be found on our website. We also have some news events. These are some older articles, but if you do want to learn more about beluga monitoring and that polar bear lawsuit, like I mentioned, you can go onto our news page. And some upcoming events. Just a heads up, we will not be having Wildlife Wednesdays in the month of December. It's kind of a busy month, so we'll be having that month free, but we will be back in the new year through April. And this is a presentation part of our Kenai Peninsula Chapter, specifically on the 3rd Wednesdays of every month. but we do have Wildlife Wednesdays, the first and second Wednesday as well. So check out our YouTube website and social media to see when those are posted. We have a Marine Mammal Festival in the works down in Homer on the peninsula around spring, March or April. So stay tuned for that. And some past events, we did some summer wildlife walks, and those were a blast, hoping to start those up again next year. Bears, birds, and beers. We followed up at a brewery every time and just had a really good time looking at wildlife and sampling beers. We also have past Wildlife Wednesdays recorded on our social media, YouTube, and website. And our calendars are going to be coming out in December. We had a wildlife calendar contest. People voted for their favorite photos, and those calendars are coming together nicely. And if you would like to purchase one for 2022, you can look for those on our website. Again, thank you so much to our members. If you would like to become a member with AWA or find out more work that we're doing, you can check out our website. That link there takes you to, if you want to become a member, it's $35 a year. So that's definitely an option, but if you want to support in other ways as well, those links or icons at the bottom are some other options. Great, thank you so much for your time with that, learning more about AWA. And right now I'm going to pass it off over to Galen and Ben, and they will teach you so much about salmon. Really looking forward to hearing what they have to share. Great, over to you.
All right, I think I've got the screen share going. Kelsey, can you just confirm that that's visible for you?
Yes, looking good.
Okay, great. I will just introduce myself really quickly and then turn it over to Ben for the first half of the presentation. I'm Galen Hecht. I coordinate Streamwatch at Kenai Watershed Forum, which is a volunteer program that you'll learn more about later and how we work to protect salmon habitat on the Kenai Peninsula. It's great to be with you tonight, and turn it over to Ben.
Yeah, and my name is Benjamin Meyer. I'm the water quality coordinator here at Kenai Watershed Forum. And yeah, again, thank you so much for joining all of us tonight. So I'll take the first half and pass it off to Galen in a few minutes here. Take slides. So just to introduce Kenai Watershed Forum, we are here in Zuldotna, and we operate on Kenai homelands, which extend throughout much of the Cook Inlet region. We were founded in 1997 to support regional efforts to study and protect local watersheds. And we have programs in research, education, and restoration. We have between typically 6 and 7 full-time staff members and about twice as many in the summer. So in this presentation tonight, I want to pose this question: how can people and wild salmon coexist? I don't think it's a question we can answer completely in tonight's presentation, but what we can do is share what we're doing and hopefully inspire you to think about what you can do too. This is a question that we must ask because wild salmon were once abundant in places that they're not now, especially in places that we don't even think that they ever were once abundant. Just so, for example, the oldest known depiction, like drawn version of a salmon, is from cave paintings in France, about 20,000 BC. By the 1600s, modern scientists estimate that about 90% of salmon abundance in Western Europe was no longer there. By the 1800s, the author Charles Dickens was writing about the plight of dwindling salmon stocks in the Thames River right through the middle of London. And in North America, on the East Coast, there are historical accounts of Revolutionary War soldiers at Fort Ticonderoga relying on Atlantic salmon to get them through the fall. Well before any of these things, of course, indigenous peoples on both the East and West Coast of North America relied on salmon as a keystone of society for many generations. Closer to home for many of us is the story of Pacific Northwest salmon, Many of the major runs on the West Coast are at less than 10% of what they were historically. So this question of how can we and wild salmon coexist is a very pertinent one here in Alaska, where populations are still strong. So to summarize all that, we have these regions of the world. I have a couple of them shown in this slide here, where people maybe once had relationships with salmon, not unlike we do here in Alaska today. That is no longer the case throughout a lot of these places. So the question is, what do we here in Alaska potentially do differently? Here we're looking at a map of the current range of wild Pacific salmon, focusing on the North Pacific here. The green colors are the terrestrial extent, and that darker blue color is the known marine extent of wild Pacific salmon. So going all the way down into Japan and even a little bit of Mexico there. But what we can see is that Alaska is really at the center of this. Alaska is the greenest part of this map. So Alaska, oftentimes in terms of many world affairs, seems very far-flung, but when it comes to the opportunity to do something differently than what's historically happened with wild salmon management, we really are here at the center of the world. And in Alaska, 9 out of 10 of us say that salmon are important to us. Our poll from 2013 found that about 90% of Alaskans said that salmon were either very important, that's that darker color on the pie chart on the left, or somewhat important. And that's interesting to me because it's estimated that only about 20% of Alaskans have sport fishing licenses. So that means that the bulk of Alaskans engage with salmon in some other way than just catching them on hook and line, whether it's commercial fishing like what's shown up on the left, subsistence fishing like what's shown on the right, personal use dip net fishing, or finally we have sport fishing over here on the lower right-hand side. Many people, of course, engage with salmon either by purchasing them or just seeing them in the wild, or even just hearing about them and knowing that they're out there. A big part of our story is that overall, wild Pacific salmon are abundant. Here we're looking at a figure from a 2016 journal article. On the bottom, on the x-axis, we have all these different years. We have 2 different colors showing the total abundance, so both catch and escapement of salmon throughout the whole North Pacific, including both wild salmon and hatchery salmon. And we see that we're in a period of high abundance currently when it comes to pink, chum, and sockeye in the North Pacific. The 2 least abundant species, coho and Chinook, are not shown on this chart. Just in terms of total numbers, they are small enough as to not affect this chart too much. But we can see that even without the hatchery populations, wild populations overall are in a period of high abundance. But this chart does not tell the whole story. There are many populations that are really struggling. So here we're looking at a plot of Yukon River historical Chinook or king salmon escapement from 1982 to 2017. We see all these years on the bottom, and we see these different colors of bars, the number of total spawning Chinook salmon in the Yukon River. And we see these green colors where the total number of salmon swimming up the Yukon made the escapement goal. That means that there's generally going to be more opportunities for people to harvest fish, versus these red years here when Yukon Chinook did not make the escapement goals and people had very little or either sometimes no opportunities to harvest Yukon Chinook. And in this region, it really affects people's ability to live and survive out there. People have relied on Yukon Chinook for subsistence purposes for many millennia. And at the same time, we see another picture here in a not very far away part of the state in Bristol Bay from just this last summer. And a fisherwoman is standing in a boat on a busy day. In fact, the largest single day harvest ever in Bristol Bay's Nushagak district. So Bristol Bay is experiencing a period of high abundance. So some populations are booming. Of course, we all wonder what is going on. That is a question that's going to be beyond the scope of this presentation. What are the year-to-year drivers of why there are many salmon or why there's few salmon? I want to talk more about what are some of the long-term drivers and specifically about habitat. So when it comes to wild salmon populations, there are some things that are in our individual control, whereas others are more in societal hands. To get a little bit more granular about that, I'll introduce the H's if you haven't heard of them before. So meet the H's. The H's are concept introduced by author and scientist David Montgomery, who wrote this book, King of Fish. And the H's are factors that can influence long-term the ability of wild salmon to survive and thrive. So the H's are hydropower, so dams, hatcheries, harvest, how many fish we catch, habitat, where do they spawn and rear, and history, what's happened before. Today, I'm really just going to focus on one of these H's. We're going to focus on habitat. And I would argue that habitat is an important one to focus on because it's the one that we interact with on the most regular basis. It's the one most in our own hands on a day-to-day basis. So then there's this question of what can we do if we want to ensure that salmon habitat remains intact for the future to continue supporting wild salmon populations. And I would argue that you could break it into 3 parts. We have step 1, find out where wild salmon live and what do they need. Secondly, we want to keep already what we have. And then finally, restore what salmon habitat we can if it's been degraded in some way. So I'm going to talk about the first 2 of these points, and Galen will mostly be covering the 3rd point here. So to start out, I'm going to introduce 2 projects that I'm involved with currently that involve finding out where wild salmon live and what they need. So sometimes when we're looking for salmon habitat, it really smacks us in the face. We see there's a stream, there's a lake, or there's the ocean, and we see salmon. So that's salmon habitat. Sometimes we can just use our eyes and we see it. But we can't always count on just our eyes to tell us whether or not something is salmon habitat. In fact, one of my favorite characters from literature, oh wait, he's not there yet, but just want you to take a look at this picture here too. So in this last picture, we see, here's a nice healthy population of adult sockeye swimming upstream. And in this picture, take a look at it too and just ponder it for a minute, think about it. Maybe tell me later what you see, what you didn't see. And the point I want to make with this picture is the same one that Detective Hercule Poirot often made, which is that the eyes of eyewitnesses are often unreliable, and sometimes the eyes see what they are meant to see. We should look for evidence beyond just our own direct experience. And in fact, I was doing some field work in this spot a few months ago, and I almost tripped over this spot here. And I put a minnow trap there and came back 24 hours later, and we had about 60 little juvenile salmon. So this is in a tributary watershed of the Kenai River called Zuldotna Creek, not far from our office here. And this was a stream that had not been on the map previously. So just literally tripped over a discovery right in my own backyard. It was really neat. But you have to go look for it, and you can't necessarily just trust what you see without taking a little bit further investigation. And so to that point, we are involved with a project where we're looking to expand what is called the Anadromous Waters Catalog, or the AWC. The Anadromous Waters Catalog is the Department of Fish and Game's database of all of the known streams and rivers and habitats where anadromous species, so species like salmon, are anadromous because they are born in fresh water, migrate out to the ocean, and then return back to fresh water to spawn. That is anadromy. So if we're talking about anadromous waters, that would include salmon as well as a few other species like lamprey and steelhead. But anyways, there's about 20,000 bodies of water in this database currently, but it's estimated that that's only about 50% of what is actually out there. A body of water is not automatically included in the Anadromous Waters Catalog unless there is unambiguous evidence that it is being used by anadromous species. So that is where the work comes in that we're doing. Here we're looking at a map of the Kenai Peninsula of all the known anadromous waters. And I, for a fact, know that there's quite a few more streams than what we're looking at here. So there's work to be done. Let's zoom in on a spot here, sort of right in between Kenai and Zuldotna, where I've put this red circle here to show an example of what I'm talking about. So here we're looking at a map of where a tributary of the Kenai River called Beaver Creek crosses the Kenai Spur Highway. We see that there's a dark blue color over on the right side, that's Beaver Creek. And we see underlying that there's this lighter turquoise color. That is the flow path of water that is flowing in Beaver Creek or into Beaver Creek. So we see there's this tributary over on the left side of Beaver Creek. And that darker blue color, that's the known extent of anadromous water, stops right at that road spot. So a couple things could happen there. Either just that was field work someone did at some point and they caught or observed salmon there and submitted that data to Fish and Game, but clearly the stream continues beyond that point. So I really am curious what's happening in this red circle, and I would be excited to go do some more minnow trapping out there next summer. Having these streams in the Fish and Game catalog is important because they are afforded an extra level of scrutiny when it comes to permitting disturbance that might happen in these areas. So identifying salmon-bearing water bodies is an important conservation strategy. We have to know where they live before we can try to preserve them. I'm going to talk next about a second project that I'm involved with here in my role, where we're looking at thermal imagery in Kenai River tributaries. So maybe you've heard of thermal imagery. This is when you can use infrared imagery, so heat sensing imagery, to take pictures of things and learn more about them. So we see someone has a neat attachment on their iPhone here, taking a picture of their dog, and the different colors are indicative of the temperature that's in that image. So we see that the dog is a different color than much of the rest of the scene. That dog, of course, is a warm-blooded animal. It's warmer than that grass. We can apply the same technology to landscape ecology to take pictures of rivers from the air and understand what kind of temperature landscape we have. So in this next picture, we're looking at a map of where a tributary of the Kenai River called Funny River crosses the road, crosses Funny River Road. And so we see the road in this lighter gray color, and Funny River itself is in this yellow color. And then off to the side, we see these darker blue and purple colors. These darker colors are indicative of colder water temperatures. So we see there's sort of a seep of cold water coming into the side right next to the road there. In fact, it's as much as 5 degrees colder than the main stem river. This is an important conservation feature in this landscape. When it comes to salmon habitat, it's really valuable to try to preserve a mosaic of different temperatures. Here, both in the sense of trying to keep all the various faucets intact that are pouring cold water into the river that can help keep temperatures more stable in the warming world that we live in. And also from the perspective of a fish moving around in its own habitat. There are times of its life when maybe they want to be in slightly cooler temperatures, and times of their life when maybe they want to be in slightly warmer temperatures, depending on what time of year it is, depending on if they're trying to digest food or look for food. A thermal mosaic is often a good place to be if you're a fish. So I had the privilege this summer of doing a little bit of field work with our collaborators on 2 other nonprofits that we're working with on this project, Cook Inlet Keeper and Kachemak Heritage Land Trust, both of which are headquartered in Homer. And here we have a picture of Claire drawing a map of that same spot that we were looking at on the map, I believe. And you'd have to squint at the picture, but she's showing cold water flowing into the warmer main stem, basically. We confirmed that what we saw on the map was what we actually saw on the ground. So that was some really neat field work. So I've talked about 2 projects that we're doing to find out where wild salmon live and what they need. And next I'm going to touch a little bit on what we can do to keep what we already have in terms of salmon habitat. So we live in a world of changing landscapes. This first changing landscape we're going to focus in on is of the lower Kenai River. And I'm going to have Kelsey post a link in the Zoom chat here that's showing an interactive sort of version of the figure that we're looking at of landscape and development change on the lower Kenai from 1950 to 2013. So in this figure on the left from Shane et al. 2017, which is a manuscript I have the privilege of co-authoring several years ago, we see the change in developed landscape in the lower Kenai River. When there's color on the map, that is indicative of a developed area, and when there's not color on the map, that is a non-developed area. So we see increasing amounts of developed area from 1950 to 1980 to 2013. But the interesting part about these numbers is if you really start zooming in on them is that they're not randomly distributed. Obviously, people like rivers and want to live next to rivers. And in fact, if you look at the area between Skilac Lake and the mouth of the Kenai River, see that almost, let me check my numbers here, but this area of the riparian zone, which we're calling 1 kilometer away from the main stem Kenai River on both sides between Skilac Lake and the mouth of the Kenai River, that 1 kilometer on either side zone, that's only about 3% of the total Kenai River watershed, but that's where about 50% of the total development has happened over the last 50 years. So focusing on what's happening in watersheds is really important from a conservation standpoint, both because people like it and because the animals that we like also like it. Here's another example of a changing landscape, and I believe Kelsey has another link that she can post in the Zoom chat. This is another interactive figure that shows the total extent of the Skilac Glacier from 1952 to 2013. And what we can see are 3 different color lines here. That turquoise line is way in the back here, but that's the total extent in 2013 versus the yellow in 1978 versus the red in 1952. So no surprise, we're seeing a retreating glacier. But interestingly, we also see a lake forming in its path. So there's a lot of dynamics going on here in terms of what it means for salmon habitat. There's, a lot of cold water flowing in. There's a new lake being created. What does this mean in terms of productivity? That's a complicated question, and I'm excited to work towards answering it, but right now I don't know the answer. The point is we live in a changing landscape. And what we want to do is give watersheds the best shot at adapting to the changes that we throw at them by keeping those corridors intact. And that's where the Mountains to Sea project comes in. The goal of the Mountains to Sea project is to focus on these watersheds that pass through areas that are protected, which are mostly in federal lands of the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge and the Chugach National Forest. So we see those watersheds highlighted in blue here, as well as the federal areas that they run through highlighted in brown, green, and blue. But if we look at an example of one of these watersheds, I think you'll start to understand why some further thought and consideration to these watersheds is worthwhile. So here again, we're looking at Beaver Creek from the air, looking at a spot where it crosses Kenai Spur Highway, excuse me. Here we're looking at an overall map of Beaver Creek. We have the flow lines in blue and the total boundaries of the watershed in that turquoise. And then the next map I'm going to show you is all of the property parcels. So the property lines that are kind of touching on Beaver Creek. We see these different color overlays as different types of property owners. So we see private property, municipal owned property, state property, federal, and native. So we see that the bulk of the watershed is in the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge or in some sort of federal property. But this corridor right along the lower river is primarily in private hands. So if you're a fish or a caribou or some kind of wildlife that is perhaps accustomed to using this entire corridor, although the bulk of the watershed might be protected, it's kind of a big deal that that lower part may not necessarily be. So as part of the Mountains to Sea project, we are working on ways to communicate with landowners to communicate the value of the ecological assets that they might have on their private property, and communicate about strategies that we can work with them on to keep these properties intact and keep that corridor along the entire watershed intact for wildlife. I have a poster here also from Shane et al. 2017 that summarizes a lot of the things I've talked about. It makes for a beautiful wall hanging. You can print it out for free if you look up the paper online. The manuscript itself is free also. It is public access. And with that, I'm going to leave off with this beautiful illustration that I think really helps make the point I've been trying to get at all along, which is that fish need land. Fish, of course, live in water, but I've been talking about land the whole time because we as humans, of course, live on land and we manage land, we affect land, and those lands affect fish. This picture makes the connection for me. And Galen is going to continue talking about ways that our organization is working with the public to restore areas that might have previously been degraded, or work to prevent areas from being degraded that see a lot of visitors. So with that, please take it away, Galen.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, and thanks everybody for joining us. I just really love hearing Ben talk about salmon. He's got such a unique understanding of them, and the paper that he referenced, the Shane et al. Paper from 2017, is a really worthwhile read. It's very comprehensible for the general public. I'm not a biologist or an ecologist, and I read it and really enjoyed it. So I would suggest taking a look at that if you want to get into a little bit more detail on some of the things Ben was talking about. And what I'm going to go into is some very pragmatic ways that individuals can get involved in trying to protect salmon habitat and restore salmon habitat as well. So I'm going to talk about restoring what we can. And I see that a comment just came in from Doug with a question, and that is really awesome. If you keep those questions rolling in whenever they spring up into your brain, just type them in the chat and we will address them in a Q&A after I finish speaking here in just a couple minutes. But yeah, so I'm going to talk about how any of us, any member of the public, can get involved in restoring and protecting what habitat we can in some very pragmatic ways. And the way that I know best how to do this is through Streamwatch, which is a program that I helped coordinate that was actually founded and is still really run by volunteers, as well as anglers in the community who want to protect some of these incredible rivers that we have on the Kenai Peninsula that house incredible runs of wild salmon. And so these volunteers assist land managers, all different agencies that are managing land on the Kenai Peninsula adjacent to the Kenai River and other rivers, with the stewardship of those streams. And we also do a lot of public outreach and education with the public to try to involve as many other people as we can in this type of work. So I'll just start by saying what is wrong with this picture. If you want to write in the chat, I'll give you 5 seconds to just take a look at this picture. There's some really good things going on in this picture, but there's also a big problem. And let's see if somebody can identify it really quick in a few words. I'm sure somebody, yes, stream bank erosion. Yeah, okay, so that area in red is totally denuded. It's a riverbank that should be covered in beautiful, lush vegetation, riparian vegetation, which just means, you know, plants on the edge of a stream in a very sort of wet area that is, you know, really a part of this stream ecosystem. It should be covered in vegetation, but it's not. And it's because of just a lot of traffic moving through this delicate space. And it's not any individual's fault, but it's just something that happens when lots of people go to visit these beautiful places. They are not durable surfaces. And so what can begin to happen is that as the vegetation disappears, the stream will start to consume the soils and sediments along its bank because they're not being held together by this vegetation. And that's erosion. And not only does it put a lot of debris into the stream, but it can start to widen the stream, which will eventually make the stream shallower. And that can actually warm the stream. And that can be detrimental to salmon and trout populations. But not just the warming is the issue. There's also a lot of problems with erosion entering stream near bank stream habitat, which I'm going to talk about shortly. And in general, this just isn't really something that we want to see. So folks in the 90s were seeing this happen. This is on the Russian River, actually, this photo, and wanted to do something about it. Here's some more photos, and you can see, you know, this guy just wants to go fishing, and he's like 6 or 8 inches deep in mud trying to get down to the river. And that's an eroding bank. And then on the right-hand side, we have another really clearly eroding bank. You can see it cracking and falling apart. And this is just, you know, we don't want to see this. It's not a good sign. And the reason that this is really concerning gets back to juvenile salmon, actually. So this is, I believe, a juvenile coho. Ben could correct me if I'm wrong. He's nodding. So, these juvenile fish spend a lot of their young lives as they're growing up in the near bank areas of streams, very close to the bank, often tucked right in under the bank. And I have a little video here that I'm going to play that helps you visualize what this looks like. So these are juvenile salmon, and you can see them hanging out, you know, just a couple inches away from the bank here. And there's some woody debris, there's, you know, sticks and rocks, and generally like lots of little nooks and crannies. And the water is also pretty clear, which is a good sign. Here we see another shot. Again, you can see the fish hanging out close to the bottom, near these nooks and crannies where they can hide. And oh, suddenly a bigger fish comes along and the little fish disappear back into those nooks and crannies. And that's really a good visualization of what biologists often refer to as cover for baby fish, areas where they can hide and try to seek safety from predator species. And they'll also hang out in these areas of maybe slower moving water, clear water near the bank, where they can wait and try to eat things as they float by. And if the water gets really turbid and dirty, it might be hard for them to identify food, and they might spend a lot of their energy and time, as Ben told me the other day, just like eating little bits of grit and whatever and spitting them out. And that's not good. So we want to keep this nursery for salmon in really good shape. So there's some ways that just as normal citizens, as individuals, we can do this, whether you're working with Streamwatch as a volunteer or with some other program, or just going out and recreating yourself. There's a lot of different ways that we can help maintain some of this near shore habitat. And I'm going to talk about what Streamwatch volunteers do through this kind of structured program to help out with that. So here we have some volunteers. These two have actually been with Streamwatch since 1994 when it started. So they've been working with us for a very long time. This is Tom and Elaine Reel. They're out on the Russian River. You can see next to them a tube that says recycle line responsibly. That is a fishing line recycling tube. So if you ever see one of those, you can put your fishing line in there and we recycle it through the program. So volunteers go out, they collect that line, clean it, and we send it to our recycling facility. Volunteers will also go in and pick up trash and fish endangering debris, wildlife endangering debris like snagged fishing line out of the riparian area. We help maintain the boardwalks that this one volunteer is standing on, and we usually don't go off them unless we're going to retrieve something. But those are other ways that we try to make a difference out on the river. We also help with various stream bank stabilization projects. This was at Big Eddy on the Kenai River. And the bank there had been denuded through just a lot of use, and with state parks and some other partners, volunteers went out and helped cable spruce to the bank. And what this does is it slows down water near the bank. Some sediment can actually settle into those revetments and and it can provide good cover as well for juvenile salmon and opportunities for plants to come back and reclaim some of that near bank riparian habitat, which is helpful. So this is just one of many techniques that are used to try to stabilize eroding stream banks. We also help stabilize angler trails. There's tons of angler trails on the Kenai Peninsula, as you can imagine. And if these trails get out of hand and there's lots of social trails, they can actually lead to quite a bit of erosion. So we'll go out at identified priority areas and try to build some structure into those trails so that they'll stop eroding, and that people will have a good trail to use instead of getting pushed to build another social trail somewhere more stable and destabilize that spot. It's kind of a domino effect. So we've helped with that a little bit as well. So lots of different opportunities. One of the big things that we do, it's quite simple, but it actually makes a huge difference for this near bank habitat, is we put up temporary habitat fencing around really, really high traffic fishing sites. So this is at Moose Range Meadows. We put up a few miles of this fence up at the Russian River every year. And what it does is it just keeps people on designated stream access where there are stairs and boardwalks, and it prevents them from walking on this really delicate vegetation, which has led to really amazing restoration of these riparian zones. So we don't have that crazy bank trampling going on that you saw in those initial photos. And it's simple. It takes a lot of work every year. It's temporary. We put it in, we maintain it through the summer, and then we take it out at the end of the summer. But it seems to make a really big difference in places where, you get tens to hundreds of thousands of fishing visitors every year. And so this seems like something that has really made a difference. And there's a lot of photographic evidence. We haven't done real scientific research on exactly how this project has benefited stream habitat, but the agencies we work with seem to see real benefit from it. And for some of you who may have visited these sites, perhaps you have seen that as well. Another thing that we do, and we're trying to do more of this each year, is help with invasive species control efforts. So this is a group of students clipping reed canary grass seed heads up in the Russian River drainage. And at the moment, we are working on identifying additional projects that Streamwatch can take part in. Next year, we had a group of volunteers actually get trained in surveying techniques, identification for species, and some manual control methods for invasive species, including reed canary grass, as well as European bird cherry, and some other species of concern for land managers in the region. And our goal is really to have a distributed understanding in the community of what priority invasive species look like, how to report them, and how homeowners can do some control on their own properties. European bird cherry is an example of a plant that has been planted in gardens in the area and can spread throughout riparian corridors. We have butter and eggs and orange hawkweed and other species in South Central Alaska that people have around their homes, and they might be able to contain them and prevent them from spreading elsewhere if they know what to do. So our goal is to kind of have a two-pronged approach: education and action from the community. We also do quite a bit of education and outreach. We'll set up booths. We have volunteers on the river almost all the time at the Russian River during the day, and also at Centennial Park in the city of Zuldotna along the Kenai, as well as other sites around the Kenai Peninsula. And these volunteers provide information on the kinds of things Ben and I have been talking about tonight to many of our fishing visitors in the area, which often comes with revelations about why people are not allowed to bank fish and that sort of thing in certain locations. And it's just so helpful to have kind of a liaison, informative presence out on the river. And we also put up signage and that sort of thing. We're really trying to encourage a culture of stewardship on Kenai Peninsula rivers so that this can bleed into other areas of our communities, and we can, develop in a way that's going to support these rivers if we are developing, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of those solutions in the future and in future slides. But we really want to encourage the community to be as friendly to wild salmon as possible. So over the years, this figure really staggers me. I have not been with the program a long time. So seeing these numbers is just really, really incredible. Over 27 years, which is longer than I've been alive, 23,300 volunteer hours have been committed, really just donated to this program, to the cause. And that's just what has been done with the program. There are Good Samaritans all over the place doing this kind of thing all the time. But to see the number of hours quantified like that, it's really something. 68,171 members of the public have been educated through the program and recorded on our data sheets. Again, a really staggering number. It's just a huge outreach effort, and it's wonderful to see that. And I think that behind those numbers, there's a lot of invisible impacts and benefits as well. 36 tons of trash have been removed from fish habitat through the program. And of that, 889 pounds of monofilament fishing line have been recycled. And that stuff is not heavy. Monofilament is very, very light. So that's a number of pallets worth of fishing line, and it could probably fill this room easily. So it's just incredible to see kind of the strength in numbers of the community of volunteers here. And so the kind of ideal outcomes here are that we have healthy protected streams and recreational access is still available. Folks have a safe way to go out and visit these streams for whatever it may be, fishing, wildlife viewing, just hiking, and the habitat that supports wild salmon is protected. So you can see, here we have a woman angling in the Russian River. The water is nice and clear. And on the right, you can see some fence that was installed by volunteers, and the riparian vegetation there is hanging out over the stream. And in general, the ecosystem seems to be doing pretty well there. And part of that is thanks to these community volunteers, which is really, really great. So here's our meme slide. Where does a fish keep his money? In a riverbank. So we all know that through our efforts here, we're investing in this riverbank, in the bank of wild salmon, which are so important for a myriad of reasons. And I'll let Ben take over from here. He kind of put together these ending slides, but yeah, I just want to thank you for your attention, and please keep those questions coming if you have it.
Sure, thank you for your eloquence, Galen. Yeah, I think this meme says it better than what I wrote on the right. Basically, just we want to keep our habitat capital in the bank. To the degree that we can do that, wild salmon will have their best shot at adapting to whatever the future brings to them. Our organization has been becoming more involved with advocating for solutions around stormwater quality. So that can include potential future projects like green infrastructure. It could also include conserving buffer zones around existing water bodies, particularly in anatomist waters. And really the bread and butter of our organization for many years has been removal and improvement of fish passage barriers. So things such as culvert replacement projects. If you are interested in volunteering with our organization for any of the things that we've talked about, or even things that we didn't talk about that we haven't even thought of yet, we're always looking for volunteers. And most importantly, we know how to have fun. So please be in touch with us. You can find all of our contact information at kenaiwatershed.org, and we'll have contact information for Galen and myself on the last slide here too. We want to take a moment to say thank you to our many funding organization and partners, too many to mention here, but we make a point to look for collaborators in all opportunities that we can. And like I said, if you have ideas for how to collaborate. If you have an idea that you want to see brought into the world, we hope that we can help make that happen. A couple of references if you do need to dig into any of the technical documents I mentioned. And finally, we just want to say thank you so much for your time. We have our emails here for both Galen and myself, a couple of other interesting salmon related links to check out. And with that, yeah, we are wrapped up for the evening, and we'll be happy to take any questions. And I see that they're continuing to pour into the chat here, so I'm going to have to take a second to read and take them all in.
I saw a few questions come in, and let's see, maybe we should just start from the top here. I think the first question was from Doug Ben, and it was about you stumbling onto juvenile salmon, and he's curious how that was connected to marine waters.
Oh yeah, in that particular place, this was a tributary of Zuldotna Creek. A little bit of it had been in the Anatomist Waters catalog previously, but the majority of it was not mapped yet. So in that case, it resulted in, I think, just under a half mile or so of Anatomist waters being identified yet. We have submitted that data. It has not been included in the catalog yet. It goes through a review process before it is accepted into their database, so we'll find out next year.
And Zuldotna Creek is a tributary of the Kenai River, so it's connected to the to marine waters through the Kenai.
Yep, it was primarily juvenile coho salmon that we captured in that spot, along with some dolly varden.
Kelsey asked a good question about, on average, how many new salmon streams are discovered each year.
That's a great question. I don't know the answer. I know who to ask, and we could get an exact number if I sat down for a little bit and did some math. But yeah, the person to ask would be folks in the habitat section, especially at the Anchorage Fish and Game Office. Well, that would be the best person to ask. The gentleman's name is Joe Giefer, who is in charge of receiving all the data for the Anatomist Waters submissions. So I would either defer to him or get in touch with me, and we can spend some time figuring out that question.
There are some interesting projects around the state going on with this. In particular, there's one in Southeast where a group of really serious steelheaders are going out to find steelhead streams that are not in the Anatomist Waters catalog, with support from Trout Unlimited from the chapter down there. And they've been really successful in finding steelhead streams that have not been listed. And in the Tongass, there's a lot of really important steelhead streams that have yet to be listed, as well as salmon streams around the state. It's kind of amazing to hear the numbers, like Ben was quoting, 20,000 streams, and that maybe only half. So it's kind of fun. Nicole asked, how much trash is usually removed each year? Streamwatch volunteers, it varies year to year, but usually somewhere between 3,000 and 6,000 pounds for the last 5 years, I would say, is pretty standard. And are there certain times with greater trash? Yes, there are. The dip net fishery definitely corresponds with a jump in coastal visitation and use. Anyone who's been to the dip net knows how many people are on the beach during the dip net. And we actually host a booth at Kenai Dip Net, an educational booth, and we do trash pickups on a daily basis there. Surprisingly, the amount of trash we've been picking up has reduced year after year since we started that booth at Kenai Beach, which is great. So it seems like the program is maybe having an impact. It's hard to say for sure, but hopefully that's a good sign.
Looks like the next point is also from Doug. And Doug, I happen to know you're at the Matsu Salmon Symposium all day today too. So very impressive long day of conferences today. So Doug mentions a point, says regarding bank protection that there's been similar measures on Campbell Creek in Anchorage, and they've been very effective across the years. especially with planting root wads into banks too. Yeah, that's a pretty standard strategy that is taught throughout the state in terms of bank stabilization. Do you have any further to speak on that point?
I do have something to say about the second point, Doug. Thank you for your points there. In terms of investing energy in containing reed canary grass and European bird cherry, that's a great question. We have an invasive species specialist in-house who could answer this in more depth, but I've heard her talk about this a number of times, and she's on the Kenai Peninsula Cooperative Invasive Species Management Area Board, and they were a couple of years ago trying to eradicate reed canary grass, and that was deemed not a productive or likely outcome. So now they're trying to work on keeping it out of priority watersheds, in particular headwaters areas. One thing that reed canary grass is really good at is outcompeting native grasses and other vegetation in riparian areas. And it can actually, on some of those tiny, really small salmon streams, it's been documented to actually like grow over the stream and could create a barrier for fish passage. So that's a real concern. And then it can also spread downstream. So folks from the invasive species management area have been trying to identify which watersheds are going to be priorities to try to prevent it from, taking over potentially really valuable fish habitat. But it is really, really aggressive, and there's a lot of it. And then with European bird cherry, it does a similar thing in riparian areas where it will just spread downstream and it can start to create a monoculture. And so really the idea is, one, to stop using it as a horticultural plant, and then two, to find priority infestations like we found it just reproducing along the Kenai River. Maura, our invasive species specialist, found it propagating along the Kenai River up in Cooper Landing. And it was just becoming basically wild there. And so they can do these really direct treatments that are quite safe in order to take down those stands of bird cherry, and that seemed like a priority.
I'm going to transition to a different slide here.
Oh, I don't think we're not sharing the screen.
Okay.
We can copy and paste the references into the chat here.
Sure.
Do you want to? What is Ed's question? Do you want to take on Ed's question?
Sure, I can refer to the last question that Doug had too. So Doug asked, what are sources of funding for your projects? I can speak to mine, and Galen might have to speak to his too. I have half a dozen or so different funding sources. I have the two different projects that I mentioned in this presentation are both funded by the Alaska Sustainable Salmon Fund, which is a program directed specifically at projects like this from federal sources that comes out on an annual basis and is you apply for it on a competitive basis. We also have additional have had funded projects from the Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation to water quality monitoring projects. We recently just received funding from the Bureau of Reclamation for a project that I'll be starting on this winter, taking a long view on water quality from work we've been doing for the last 20 years. So the answer is it's a diversity. There is a diversity of sources for the work that we do.
Streamwatch primarily works with agency partners in the area. The U.S. Forest Service is our collaborator in administering the program, and we get some funding from them. We've had some funding that's actually from NOAA that has been that came to us through Pacific States Marine Fisheries Commission. We get a little bit of funding from Alaska DNR and the Kenai Peninsula Fish Habitat Partnership as well. We've been funded by the Exxon Valdez Oil Spill Trustee Council in the past, as well as a variety of other partners. We have some smaller grants and then some bigger ones, but I think that would cover the bigger ones that we've had in the last 5 years.
Looks like the question from Ed Schmidt here is directed at me. He says, abundance in the dictionary means a very large quantity of something. So it makes sense to refer to salmon stocks that are declining with the word abundance. I take that point, Ed. I appreciate it. Yeah, that's a good question. Biologists often refer to fluctuating population size as periods of low abundance or periods of high abundance. It's a good question as whether the semantics of that term are enough to influence the way we think about these issues, and maybe there's more appropriate vocabulary. I will take that to heart.
Thank you.
I think that wraps up your questions that I can see. If there are additionals, people can throw them in last minute. And I saw you put your emails there at the end. So if people get more questions, they can always reach out to you there. Wow, I learned a ton. I am still kind of blown away by the fact that there's like 900 pounds of fishing line you guys have taken care of, and all that trash is just pretty staggering, because I picture a ball of fishing line as being so incredibly lightweight. So I can't imagine 900 pounds, what that would look like. But and the new salmon streams that are discovered every year or every so often is pretty, also something you don't really think about, that there's so much we have yet to see. So awesome. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your expertise, and for just, again, taking your time to volunteer to be here. It means so much. And I want to give another shout out to any of our members that are here tonight, because you made this presentation free. And so really it takes a village. So I really appreciate having the volunteers being here and members. And it means a lot to AWA and Kenai Watershed Forum. So thank you. If anyone is interested in becoming a member with AWA, here's a link there. Again, I mentioned it's about $35 a year. But otherwise, if anyone has any kudos or thank yous, you can throw all of that into the chat, and we're going to stop recording right now, actually.